networks.
Okay, that's fine.
There you go.
No worries.
Hey everyone, very happy to be live with Alis Hawkins. Would you like to start us off with an introduction to yourself and your book?
To myself, absolutely. So I'm a historical crime writer. I have 2 historical series. The first is set in the 19th century, the mid-19th century in West Wales. And my 2 main characters are Harry Probert Lloyd, who is a partially blind young man, an ex-barrister who's been forced home by his blindness and who, to cut a very long story short, ends up investigating murders and subsequently becomes the coroner. That's called the Tyvey Valley Coroner series. And my current series is the Oxford Mysteries, and the book we're talking about tonight, The Hunters Club. Oh, that's all the wrong way around, isn't it? Never mind. Is the third in the series, and this also has 2 main protagonists. Non Vaughan, who is a young woman from the Tyvey Valley. I couldn't abandon it altogether. I've just taken her to Oxford at the beginning of the Women's College movement, and she's a bit of a fish out of water, is Non. She's a working class woman in a middle class world in Oxford, learning at the university. And she ends up investigating murders with Basil Rice, who is her friend, and he is a Jesus College lecturer. But he also has a secret because Basil is gay in a time when you really don't want to be gay, or you certainly don't want anybody else to know that you're gay.
True. I mean, also you've got the whole, I was thinking about this when I was reading book 3, like the world of a university like Oxford is so different to most people's experience, even like then and now, because like that college system is quite unique to only a certain universities, isn't it?
Sure, yeah, Oxford and Cambridge are pretty much it. I know Durham technically has a collegiate system, but it's not quite the same as that at Oxford and Cambridge. So I think at Durham they're more like halls of residence, whereas each individual college at Oxford is a completely self-enclosed community. You know, you have your tutorials there, you have everything there, and then you'd only go out for lectures. And in the time that we're talking about, in the 1880s, they didn't have so many big lectures outside the colleges, so you'd even have your lectures in the college as well. So it very much was a kind of self-enclosed, slightly monastic community, each one. And that's one of the things that Non finds so difficult to cope with when she gets there, because she has no way in. She's gone there to study, but there are no women's colleges yet. There are just these 2 halls of residence, Somerville Hall and Lady Margaret Hall. And they have lectures at these rented rooms in St Giles. It's very different to the men's college world, but the women are allowed into some colleges to attend lectures under sufferance, and they have to be chaperoned, and they're not allowed to speak or ask questions. They just have to sit quietly. And Non finds all this incredibly difficult because she is, being a working class woman from West Wales, where women were treated very differently to women in England. She's used to being able to express her opinion, speak when she likes, go where she likes, do what she likes, and certainly not be chaperoned. So having to shoehorn herself into that very, very, very male, very enclosed, very exclusive, and literally exclusive of women, that sort of community. Yes, she's constantly struggling against that and trying to see where she fits in.
What was that experience like? I mean, you might not know the answer to this, for women at that time at other universities.
So there weren't many universities at all at the time. So we had Oxford and Cambridge, the 2 universities in London, so University College and King's College, and Manchester. I'm not sure when Durham was set up. I'm not sure whether Durham was already a thing by this point. But women's experience at London was different to the extent that they were actually allowed to take the same exams as men and take degrees. So they did have quite a different experience, because the London universities didn't have this enormously long history of being male-only institutions. I mean, obviously Oxford and Cambridge go right back to the monastic period. I mean, when those universities were set up, they were set up very much to train priests. And there's still that kind of monastic feeling. Whereas the new universities at London, I mean, King's College was established specifically to be outside religion. You know, it was described by some people as that godless institution in London. So it was very much, you did not have to be religious. In fact, they kind of quite encouraged the non-religious to go to King's College. And University College, similarly, it wasn't quite so godless, but it certainly didn't require any kind of religious affiliation. Whereas at Oxford, by this point, by the 1880s, you didn't have to be an Anglican. 20 years earlier, only Anglicans could attend Oxford and Cambridge. You weren't allowed to go if you were a Jew or a Catholic or a nonconformist. You had to subscribe to the 39 Articles. So it was very exclusive of other people. Whereas London and Manchester was set up, of course, to be a much more scientific university. As were King's and University College. They were very much looking to the future, not to the past. You know, they weren't teaching classics and that kind of thing. They were teaching the new modern sciences and medicine and natural sciences and what have you. So the women there, I mean, I'm not going to say that they were welcomed with open arms by the other men, but they were accepted to a far greater degree than they were at Oxford.
Yeah, I just Googled when my university was founded.
Okay.
That I went to. It had a medical school from 1831.
Oh, wow. Where did you go?
Leeds.
Okay, wow.
It was founded as a university in 1904.
Right, yeah, because the medical schools did tend to exist sort of slightly separately from the universities, didn't they? Because you didn't have to have a medical degree. In fact, it was quite difficult to get a medical degree to train as a doctor. So lots of men left Oxford with a degree in something else and then went to train as a doctor at a medical school in London. So because you couldn't actually do a medical degree at Oxford at that point. So yeah, it's all very, very confusing in terms of what happened when and what, you know, who was doing what.
I've thought this one as well, this book in particular, sort of really focuses on that impact that the university has, not just in that kind of enclosed college life, but onto the actual people outside of Oxford, you know, like the general kind of public around the university.
I think it's the most town versus gown of the three books, absolutely. So obviously there's bits of town and bits of gown in all three books, but this one, they come into direct conflict. So just to talk about the kind of setup, if you like, a bit, there were two big inspirations. Well, actually, there were three big inspirations for me in this book, but I can't talk about one because it's a massive spoiler, even though it was something which happened in the contemporary world a few years ago, which kind of inspired this. It would still give away far too much about what happens in the book, so I'm not going to talk about that. But if anybody watching this tonight reads the book and wants to know what that third inspiration was, just get in touch with me via my website and I'll email you and tell you. But the other two were, firstly, when I was doing the research for the last book, The Skeleton Army, I came across the notion of the Vice-Chancellor's Court. So we were talking just now about how Oxford was very much an evolution of the monastic system. And in the same way, in the medieval period, you probably know this, so stop me if you know this, if you were in holy orders, and something like a third of men in the medieval period were attached to the church in some way, they were in holy orders, you weren't liable to be tried in normal courts. You were tried in church courts, which were much more lenient. They didn't have the death sentence, for instance. And all you had to do to prove that you had a right to be charged, to be tried in the church courts, was that you could read and write. And that was considered to be, yeah, you were in holy orders, because only people who were going to be involved in the church, either as priests or monks or in minor orders, therefore working for the state as a kind of civil servant, those are the only people in the medieval period who were taught to read and write. And the Vice-Chancellor's Court in Oxford and Cambridge is a kind of hangover of that sort of church court, because it existed, doesn't exist anymore, to try dons and junior members of the university who'd transgressed. So if a young man, an undergraduate, was arrested by the police, or indeed anybody else, and taken to the police station for being drunk and disorderly or brawling in the street or whatever, he'd be hauled up by the magistrates the following morning. And the solicitor for the university would appear and they'd say, I beg the magistrate's indulgence for me to be allowed to take this young man away and present him at the Vice-Chancellor's Court this afternoon. So the Vice-Chancellor would try him, and he would be disciplined by the Vice-Chancellor's court rather than going through the actual normal court procedure. So this was completely outside the normal law of England and Wales. And at this point, there was a huge move to moral purity, in other words, sexual purity, in the country in general, but particularly in Oxford. They recently had a Christian mission by two American evangelists, Moody and Sankey, whose names, if they seem familiar, they left behind a hymn book, and you occasionally see references to the Moody and Sankey hymn book. And in the wake of that, there was this huge uprising, amongst undergraduates of wanting to be moral, wanting to be pure, wanting to live a kind of moral life. And it was a bit like that thing in America a few years ago, the silver ring thing, where people pledged celibacy until marriage. It was a bit like that. And the proctors, the senior disciplinary officers of Oxford, decided to join in with that thing. And they were having a purge against undergraduates associating with young women of the town, by which, of course, I mean young working class women. They didn't have the chance to associate with young middle class women because they were indoors and chaperoned and blah. So the proctors would do their rounds every evening from about 6 till midnight to see what undergraduates were getting up to, because in theory they were allowed out until 9 o'clock, but they weren't allowed to go to pubs. They weren't allowed to consort with anybody, so they didn't really have much to be doing in town. So the proctors would wander around, making sure that they weren't doing things they didn't ought to have done. And at this point, if an undergraduate was found with a young woman, I mean, and we're not talking in a compromising position here, we're talking about maybe just walking up the street or having a conversation, then the proctors would nab them both. They'd march the young man back to his college, and he'd be disciplined by the college for having immoral intentions, as they said, that he might have been wanting to do something and didn't have the chance. But the young woman was treated much more harshly. She was marched off to the cells underneath the university offices in Clarendon House, and then the following morning would be taken to the magistrates' court and thrown into prison, despite the fact that she had, in terms of the statute book, committed no crime. So this was, it wasn't taken to the magistrates' court, she was taken to the Vice-Chancellor's court. That's the point. So the Vice-Chancellor's court could send people to prison, even if they'd committed no actual crime on the statute books. And in this particular era, it was young women who were being treated in this way. And I came across the case of a young woman, actually in Cambridge rather than Oxford, Alis Hawkins, who in 1891, she was sent to prison for consorting. In other words, just being in conversation with an undergraduate, thrown into jail. But she or her family had more resources than most, and they secured the services of a barrister who applied for a writ of habeas corpus and got her out, and then proceeded to sue the senior proctor for false imprisonment. Didn't win. I mean, they knew they weren't going to win. That wasn't the point of bringing the case. The case was brought to highlight what was going on, because people didn't really know that the Vice-Chancellor's courts at Oxford and Cambridge had this kind of power. And that pretty much signaled the end of that sort of shenanigans. And when I read that case, I thought, that's got to be, I've got to put that in my next book. So I've got a Alis Hawkins character in my book, in the Hunters Club, and right at the beginning of the book, she is trying to secure the services of Non, who is now working part-time as a journalist and part-time as a tutor. She wants Non to help her clear her name, because once you'd been in jail and been labelled a prostitute, because that's the basis on which you were getting sent to jail, that you were soliciting these young men for sex. Once you had that label on you, nobody else was going to give you a job. So in a way, the university weirdly and ironically was bringing about the very thing it was trying to prevent. It was actually putting more young women into prostitution on the streets rather than clearing the streets of prostitutes, because they had no choice. So in my character's case, Sarah Critchley's case, she doesn't want that fate. She wants her name to be cleared so that she can have a normal, nice life. So she comes to Non and asks her to clear her name. Meanwhile, Basil, Non's not sidekick. He's not her sidekick. The other viewpoint character. He's got his own investigation because there are sinister attacks on undergraduates happening in Oxford, and young men are being found bound, gagged, and hooded outside the gates of their colleges. And the senior proctor has asked Basil to investigate to see who's doing this and why, and try and make sure that nothing worse happens, because, you know, if violence escalates, you know, we could end up with a death. So this is the first of my crime books that hasn't started with a dead body. So it's quite a while until somebody dies. In fact, when I started the book, I had no idea who was going to die. So
Really?
Oh, I don't plan my books. I know how they start, and that's all I know. I don't know. I never know who's done it. I don't even know who's going to be in the book. So I just find out as I go along.
There must be some amount of pre-thinking or planning, though, because you must do so much research.
I do a lot of research. So there's always the what we call the thematic settings. Obviously, the literal locational setting is Oxford, but each of the stories will have a thematic setting. So in the first, it's the patent remedy industry. In the second, it's the Salvation Army versus the Skeleton Army, and in this one, it's this gender war between the university and the young women of the town. So I knew a lot about that. Hence my starting off point. But that's pretty much all I knew. There was a real character that I found out about in my research, who I have included in the book. So I knew she would have to appear, but she appears in the first chapter. So yeah, then I just have to. Non goes about finding out what's going on. So as she meets people, I meet them. As she discovers what's going on, I discover what's going on. So somebody recently, this last week, when I've been doing launch events, said, "Oh, so you write like a reader? You find out what's going on as you write?" And I said, "Yeah, that's exactly right."
That's amazing. So I would never have predicted that either with your books, because they're so complex.
There are two camps in the crime fiction world. There's the pantsers, people like me who fly by the seat of their pants, and the plotters, the people who know exactly what's going to happen in advance. And some go to extremes and have spreadsheets where every chapter they know who's going to be in it and what they're going to say and where they're going to be, and they have things like what I want the reader to know at the end of this chapter. And to me, that, oh gosh, I couldn't write like that. Be like, after you've done all that, I wouldn't be interested, because all the interesting stuff's been done. So no, and I need my characters drive what happens. You know, I'm not plot driven. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, I like to think that my plots are quite complicated, but I don't start off with the plot in my head. I'm not good at thinking up stories in the abstract. What I'm good at, if I'm good at anything, is creating characters who then find a story for me. And all that research that I've done is kind of sitting in my subconscious. It's kind of like in this soup of the primeval soup of research and ideas and worldview and experiences I've had, and you know, all of this, and the story comes out of that through the prism of the central theme. So it's a kind of complicated but interesting way of writing. So I'm always looking through the eyes of my characters. I think this is one of the reasons that I always write in the first person, the I voice, because I am literally doing all this through my characters. They're doing it all for me. They're doing all the work for me.
I was going to ask you about the real person who appears, because she's amazing.
Okay. She is amazing, right? She is amazing. So Miss Felicia Skene, if she hadn't existed, I would have had to invent her. I would have had to invent somebody like her, but I couldn't possibly have invented somebody as brilliant as her. So she was the daughter of a baronet, a Scottish baronet. So she was bona fide aristocracy, and she moved around a lot with her parents during her youth, and had quite an adventurous youth, including going traveling unchaperoned in a way with men. She went on a long journey with a vicar and his son, which, had she done that in Britain, would have been quite scandalous, but they were in Greece, so that kind of worked. And she was a very devout Christian woman, and she felt very much called by God to minister to the poor. But at a time when most middle class or upper class women who felt that they wanted to minister to the poor sat on committees or set up charities or, raised money, they were always at a distance from the poor people that they were trying to work with. Felicity Skene wasn't like that. She wanted to actually talk to real people. She wanted to be in contact, literal physical contact with real people. So once her parents were no longer on the scene, she was a very dutiful daughter, and she looked after them till they died. So in early middle age, she moved into this little house in Oxford. So her parents had a big house. So she downsized, gave away tons of money. She was always giving away money, and proceeded to devote herself to the poor. So she was a prison visitor, and she didn't just go into the prison and look at conditions and then sort of wag her finger and say, oh, this isn't how it should be. She went into cells. She was there to talk to the individuals. She wanted to comfort people. She sat with the dying. She sat with people before they were executed. She went in, she met every single woman who was released from prison and tried to improve her life in some way, either by persuading her to go into the women's refuge if she'd been, under the thumb of a pimp or, an abusive husband or boyfriend, giving her money, taking her home and giving her breakfast, encouraging her to get a separation order if she was, living in an abusive relationship. She really worked with people. She wasn't interested in being this remote figure. And this was quite scandalous at the time. Middle class and upper class people didn't do that. They didn't associate with lower class people as if they were real people, because there was this huge divide really between the middle classes and the lower classes, and definitely the upper classes. There was this feeling that almost the working classes were a different species. Middle class people felt that working class people didn't have finer feelings like they did. They weren't able to be intellectual in the same way that middle class people were. They couldn't think on that level, and that they were genetically predisposed to be criminal. It was believed at the time that being a criminal was a hereditary condition, and the only middle class and upper class people who could possibly be criminal were the insane. There was this incredible, I know we have a class system now, but then there was just this, yes, we're just different sorts of human being. Very odd. And Felicity Skene just completely was like, no, that's not right. I believe in Jesus, and he said everybody's the same, so that's how I'm going to live. And she gave away tons of money. She wrote books, and she gave that money away as well when she earned money. And she was constantly writing letters. She wrote to everybody from the Prime Minister. She kept up numerous friendships. She wrote to ex-convicts. People kept in touch with her, and her front door was literally always open, and she would let anybody in and help them however she could, by talking to them or by helping them with money or advice. She was the most extraordinary person. And she had a succession of little not spaniels, terriers, all of whom were called Tatters. Tatters 1, Tatters 2, and a parrot. I couldn't have made up the parrot, but she had a parrot, and so the parrot appears in the book as well. But she's extraordinary, and she's one of the very few people who can challenge Non. She's kind of thinking about moving towards atheism. She's really not interested in Christianity, thinks it's done a lot of damage in the world. But Miss Skene challenges her, and she pretty much tells Non that her view of Christianity is intellectually not rigorous. And Non is like kind of, oh my gosh, because she's not used to being challenged in that way. So she's one of the few people on Non's intellectual level. So I just loved Felicity Skene so much.
Yeah, I did as well. Is she going to appear in other books, do you think, now you've discovered it?
I don't know. Yeah, she kind of appears off camera in my current book, because of things that happen in the Hunters Club. She remains in Non's life, but so far she hasn't actually appeared in person in the current book. But yes, I think she probably will, because she was a huge presence in Oxford. And I find it really sad that she's not known about now. because she's this huge Oxford character. But she said something at the time, which I've actually quoted in the book, when Non tells her she should be much better known, and she said, "My dear, I'm not interesting. I'm like the Martyrs' Memorial, known by everybody, interesting to nobody." So that's a direct quote from her, which I've put into the book. And she was known to everybody, but I think she was entirely wrong in saying that she was interesting to nobody. I think everybody thought she was fairly extraordinary.
Well, it sounds like she was fairly extraordinary.
Yeah, no, she was. She was one of a kind. Absolutely.
Non makes a really interesting comparison when she's writing reports about what happens between what the Vice Chancellor's courts are doing in Oxford and Cambridge with the Contagious Diseases Act.
Oh, wow, yes. The awful Contagious Diseases Act. So this actually was a series of acts enacted by the government to try and stop the spread of venereal disease amongst sailors and soldiers, because it was having a debilitating effect on the fighting force of the country. And the government was always worried about being invaded or war on the streets or, whatever. So they had to keep the fighting men in good fettle. And venereal disease was rife. So they passed the Contagious Diseases Act to basically try and take prostitutes off the streets. So these acts applied to specific towns, ports and garrison towns, basically. And in those towns, specific officers were allowed to roam the streets, and they were plainclothes officers, so they were kind of undercover, and they could arrest any woman that they suspected of being a prostitute, which pretty well turned out to mean any woman seen on the streets anywhere near the army barracks or the port. And they would march her off to be examined by a medical officer, and one of the women who was campaigning against these acts, Josephine Butler, who campaigned for many years against the Contagious Diseases Act, she called it rape by speculum, because they were forced to undergo this examination, and it was awful. And if they were found to be infected with the venereal disease, they were thrown in jail until either they died or they were better. So yeah, absolutely dreadful. And again, these women have committed no actual crime. This was a specific power given to these officers just because the government was so worried about venereal disease. But so instead of saying to the men, well, just don't, they go for the women. So it's all the time in this book. It's the women who are being criminalized for men's activity. It's the men who are going out paying women for sex, but it's the women who are being penalized. And this was known as the double standard of sexual morality, that women were supposed to be pure, but boys will be boys, and that's one of the big themes in the book. And it really enraged me because my grandmother was a Victorian. She was born in 1899. And when she was 14 in 1913, so before the First World War, she went into service. In other words, she went to work in somebody's house to be a housemaid. And at some point, and I'm not quite sure about this because I only got a very sketchy story from my mum after my nan had died. At some point, the son of the household made it clear to my grandmother that he thought she was his for the taking. And she disabused him of that notion. Not quite sure how, but let's say she had two older brothers who were minors, and I'm pretty sure they taught her some fairly useful defensive maneuvers. But anyway, Nan was sacked by the family, so goodness knows what he said to his parents. But Nan, if she had had good self-esteem, if she hadn't thought, no, this isn't happening to me, thank you, she could so easily have ended up pregnant, probably thrown out by her family, which is what happens to one of the girls in the book. And I thought, this could have been my family, this could have been my grandmother. And it happened to so many young women, and they were always the ones criticized, despite the fact that in the vast majority of cases this would have been rape. Because no housemaid was going to be under the impression that she was going to marry the son of the house, because of this divide between the working class and the middle class. So, who was going to go willingly into that kind of situation. I mean, I suppose some might have thought, well, I can get him to pay me money, but you know, the majority would have had no choice about this, and this enraged me, let's say. Somebody once in the first event I did, somebody came up to me afterwards and she said, "You're very angry, aren't you, about this?" And I said, "Yeah, this rage kind of drove me through the book, and I think it does come over. It's the darkest book I've written, and it's the most angry book I've written."
It's really enraging when you read about things like that. I read a book about like women and the law through history, and it talked about things like the Contagious Diseases Act.
Yeah.
And I was just
Absolutely
like,
dreadful.
it just made me so angry. I just kept
Yeah.
like, sort of like putting it down, going like,
I know. It's absolutely dreadful. I hadn't, until I did the research for this book, I hadn't heard of the Contagious Diseases Act, but it took about 20 years to get them repealed. And one of the women, Josephine Butler, I mean, she campaigned for so many years about this, and many people campaigned, actually, and it wasn't only women fighting against this. There were many men, and this is one of the things that I've been really fascinated about in doing the research for all these books, the extent to which the nascent women's movement and the fight for women's rights was supported by men. You know, it wasn't just women. There were lots of men saying, no, this isn't right. The way women are treated is not right. The way women are regarded as second-class citizens is not right. Because if you think about it, in this period, the 1880s, excuse me, it's almost 100 years since Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which kind of kicked off, if you like, the women's rights movement. And we've not really shifted the dial very far in those 100 years. And there's now a bit of a pile on, because we all know about, you know, the campaign for the votes for women. I mean, that was a tiny part of women trying to get a more just society. You know, just having the vote, that wouldn't have been enough. They needed to be employed, they needed to be educated, they needed to be allowed to own property. You know, in the 1880s, we're a few years into women being able to own their own property. Prior to that, prior to the Married Women's Property Act, which I think was 1881, it was certainly in the 1880s, women, once they got married, they couldn't own any property. Anything they earned, anything that was given to them, automatically belonged to their husband. So it was incredibly difficult for a woman to leave her husband, because she would have to live with nothing, including her children, because her children also belonged to her husband. You know, so the women's movement was trying to secure equality on all those fronts. You know, it wasn't just about suffrage, it wasn't just about the vote. You know, that wasn't even the most important thing, frankly.
No, and it is. I mean, I know the thing you were saying that we can't talk about, the sort of modern case as well. You mentioned it in the back, and it is one of the things I was saying as I was reading the book to my husband. I don't know if it's the most chilling one, because it feels like it could still happen today.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I didn't set out to do this, but I've basically written a Me Too book, you know, because absolutely it could happen today. Absolutely. You know, it's because so little has changed. Gender politics, you know, we'd all like to think we've moved on, but we haven't, or not everybody has, you know. So somebody said to me, one of the questions after one of my events, they said, what would Non think if she could come back now? And I said, well, she'd be delighted about some things, you know, because, you know, in many ways, you know, women have full employment rights now, and we have the vote. And I said, but she would be horrified at how little gender politics has changed. You know, that we really need to do better on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. Oh, people ask great questions, actually, when I'm doing these events. It's always really great.
It is quite interesting in just a short amount of time that we've been following Non and Basil in the book. Although you're right about some things not changing much, there is a lot of change in Oxford.
Yes.
In that
Yes.
small time, and you can sort of
Yes.
see how things are changing to become how it is.
That's true. That's one of the reasons that I chose this period to write about, because it's not just the women's, well, I mean, I'm going to say the women's colleges being established, and they weren't colleges to start off with. As I say, they were just halls of residence for the women who were coming to avail themselves of the lectures. It wasn't just that. It was the fact that in the 1850s, the government had set up a royal commission to look at Oxford and Cambridge, because they were falling behind the new universities in Manchester and London particularly, and the government basically did a big shake-up of Oxford and Cambridge, and they said, look, you've got to cut away the deadwood, you've got to do better, stop sitting on your laurels. So a lot of the non-resident fellows were basically cut off, because you could draw a stipend from Oxford as a fellow and do nothing. It was awful. So now they made all resident fellows teach. They made it quite difficult to be an undergraduate and not be studying for a degree, because prior to that, lots of young men had gone to Oxford as a kind of finishing school with no intention of doing a degree. They were just there to meet the right people and to kind of, acquire a certain social sheen. But the government said, no, universities, that's not what universities are for. Universities are there to teach. We want, a bit like now, we want to educate people so that we can move forward as a country and be world leaders in whatever it was. So you need to get with the program, Oxford and Cambridge. You need to do medicine. You need to do natural sciences. All this classics is all very well, but what's it doing in the world? So that was a huge change, and it really rocked the foundations of Oxford and Cambridge. And then you've got, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that they were basically tearing up the relationship between the church and the colleges. So now you didn't have to be a member of the church. You could be an atheist if you liked. Shelley in the 1830s was sent down for being an atheist. He was thrown out of the university. But now you don't have to be religious at all. You can just do what you like. And then in 1877, they allowed dons to be married. Prior to that, there were no women in the colleges. The only man in any college who was allowed to be married was the head of the college. And other than that, all the men were celibate. Obviously, all the undergraduates were celibate. All the servants were men. There might be the odd laundress who was a woman, but that was it. So these were incredibly male places. And then suddenly, into this really difficult situation where everything's being made to be more modern and more forward looking, and gosh, you're going to have to actually do some work now if you're going to be a fellow of an Oxford college. And then they have the everybody's getting married. The fellows, there was, as the Dean of Merton said, an unseemly rush to the altar. So many dons went off and found wives, and so they left the colleges and started living with their families in the rapidly expanding suburb of North Oxford, which was just stuffed with the expanding and aspirant middle class and all the now married dons and their families. And on top of all of that, oh my God, now the women want to come and study here. So there was just so much going on, so much change, so much resentment from the non-progressives, both to the women, but also to the men who were driving this. So there was a lot of conflict. And what crime writers like is conflict, because conflict breeds violence and resentment, and eventually there will be a body somewhere. So.
G on here has said that she loves Non and is really looking forward to reading The Hunters Club.
I'm so pleased. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm looking forward to everybody reading this book. I'm really interested actually to see what people's reaction to it is. I mean, I'm always excited about a new book coming out, but there's something about The Hunters Club that it just feels, I guess you said it earlier, it just feels so relevant now. It's I think people are going to identify with Non and with the other characters in a way that possibly, I think people have always identified with Non, but this is going to really, I think, engage people.
Yeah, I guess it's the most relevant in the modern time.
Yeah.
One, but I think people have always loved Non.
Yeah, I think that's true, and people are beginning to love Basil as well. I think somebody said to me, one of the people who've chaired events this week, he said, Non and Basil are really influencing each other, aren't they? Because Non's becoming more subtle I mean, she's still non, but she's learning guile, and she's learning that sometimes it's best not to go in all guns blazing, but to try and maybe play the long game a little bit and be a bit more subtle. And by the same token, Basil is learning from Non, and he's being more Non. He's being more confident. You know, he's not so backward in coming forward now, and he's just spent, before this book starts, he spent 2 years being a guardian of the poor, which was a kind of, it was a role within the local authority, which had people working, what had middle class people working very closely with very, very poor people, and trying to help them by the disbursement of public money, and trying to keep people out of the workhouse. So he's seen a different aspect of life. So he's moved outside his very cloistered, literally cloistered college life, and moved into the real world, and that's given him a lot of confidence, and people relying on him and expecting him, and looking to him to sort out their problems and to help, has given him a lot more confidence. And I think he feels a lot more agency now. He's not quite so much the university man. He's not quite so tied to the university hierarchy. So I think he's even begun to imagine a life possibly outside the university might be possible for him. So yes, they're both changing. But like we say these days, they're both on a journey.
But we've also got Tarly, who's not had a mention yet.
Tarly, I know.
So
the lovely Tarly.
I love so much as another kind of character in the book.
Yeah.
And big things kind of happen for Tarly in this one, don't they? Big sort of changes to his story.
Yes, definitely. I mean, everybody's got, all major characters in any book have to have a character arc. They can't just be there, just going along. You know, things have to happen to them. They have to change. They have to, they have to be moving towards the resolution of a problem. And in Tarly's case, the problem is, will Non marry him? And also he's got this sick mother who becomes a lot sicker in my current book, and he has to decide what to do with the rest of his life. And obviously he gets involved in the investigation as well. And he and Non, and Non's cousin, or third cousin once removed, on, or whatever Albie is, they end up patrolling the streets late at night with Non dressed as a boy. Non loves to dress as a boy. In my current book, book 4, she adopts a bicycle, which means that she has to wear trousers. So, oh my goodness, all hell breaks loose then, I tell you. There's a lot of women wearing trousers in book 4. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about that, am I? So
no, you can drop us hints about book 4. Do we get answers in book 4 for how the end of book 3 is left?
Things move on, obviously, but well, I haven't finished writing book 4 yet. I'm only halfway through, so I don't actually know where we're going to get to by the end, because my characters haven't told me yet. So we're moving towards an answer, definitely, but there are a lot of factors in play. Because Non, obviously, in the Hunters Club, I mean, she's trying to work out what she feels about marriage, and all this shenanigans that are going on, all this sexual politics, you know, all this stuff in the mix. It's not a great advert for male-female relationships, and that's affecting her view of marriage. And she actually writes an article, which is included in the book, about what marriage means to women, and how most women don't have a choice but to get married, because you cannot have an independent life apart from your parents, certainly as a middle-class woman, unless you marry. It's the only way you can leave home. And Non, she's very ambivalent about her own relationship to marriage, because she is independent. She's earning her own money. She's living away from her dad's dead, as we know from the other books. She's moved away from her mother. She has established an independent life. She doesn't have to get married. The only reason for Non to get married is for love, or if she decides she wants children. And she just doesn't know at the moment whether getting married would give her more than she's got, or whether she would have to compromise too much. and that's an ongoing debate in her own mind in the current book as well. But she can't keep shilly-shallying forever, because at some point Tali has to decide, am I going to stay in Oxford or am I going to go and seek my fortune in London? So yes, a decision will have to be made at some point.
That's true. Sorry, I had to ask. I got to
No,
ask.
that's all right.
It's one of those ongoing situations,
Yes.
isn't it? From like
Yes. Yeah.
her and Tali's relationship.
The will they, won't they? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people, other writers say, oh, you need to keep this will they, won't they going for a while, yeah, because it's a big driver. People will buy the books to know. And I'm like, well, yes, but actually that wouldn't necessarily be that realistic, because they would have to decide. And also it might be quite interesting in a future book to look at how they're, if they do get married, how they're negotiating that. And, how do they do marriage? Do they manage to find a very different way of doing marriage? So they just have not revealed to me yet what's going to happen at the end of this book. So we wait in hope.
I think you're right, though. I think there is a point where you've got to have an answer.
Yes, I agree.
I
mean, it's like with the Robert Galbraith books, the J.K. Rowling Cormorant Strike books. She has spun out the will they, won't they far too long. It's just getting boring now. You think, oh, come on, no, I just don't believe this anymore. It's just unrealistic. So do something different with their relationship. Don't keep dragging it out. So I don't want to get to that point. I think are we on book 7 with her, and they still haven't had a proper conversation about whether they're going to be together. It's just not realistic, is it? So anyway, sorry, I shouldn't criticize other people's writing.
It's okay, I've not read beyond book 1 of that.
So, oh right, are you not a fan?
No, not really.
Okay, I think they're quite good. I mean, obviously J.K. Rowling's become a bit of a problematic issue, but if you can divorce her from the books, if that's at all possible, I do think they're quite good, actually.
I'm a big fan of like historical crime and things like that.
Excellent, good. Glad to hear it.
To be honest, much bigger fan. What have you read recently and really enjoyed?
What have I read recently and really enjoyed? Gosh, what have I read recently and enjoyed? At the moment, I'm reading Wasim Khan's new book, so the latest Persis Wadia book. So that's an advanced review copy. I'm a big fan of that series. I don't know if have you read that series?
I've read some of them. I'm reading Wasim Khan as well at the moment, but the Quantum Menace.
Okay, you're reading his other one. Okay, yeah. So I'm reading that. I'm a big fan of that. I've read Anne Cleeves' new one. Again, it's an advanced review copy. So I was a huge fan of the Shetland series, and she's now taken. So Jimmy Perez left Shetland and said she felt she'd said all she could about Shetland. I think she only intended writing 3 books, and she wrote 8 in the end in the Shetland series. So Jimmy Perez got married, but anyway, he hooked up with somebody, and he and his partner and their child son are now living in Orkney. So now we've got a new series, the Jimmy Perez series set on Orkney. So I've just read the first of those, The Killing Stones. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Really nice. The other book I've read, not a crime book, but a book set in Oxford, historical Oxford, The Eights. So it's about a group of young women at Somerville College immediately after the First World War. And the Eights are 4 young women who live on Corridor 8. That's why they're called the Eights at Somerville. And it's a brilliant portrayal of life in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. It's a brilliant portrayal of young women at Oxford, just at the point where they are allowed to be members of the university and get degrees and actually do all the exams and what have you. But one of the things that I found fascinating wasn't just the life of women at an Oxford college. It was that view of what the war had done to people, not just the fighting men, although I think there were 1 or 2 fighting men in it who clearly it had an absolutely devastating effect on. But what effect did it have on people who were left at home? How did they view the war? What psychological effect did the war have on them? What effect did it have on the women who went out to drive ambulances and to be nurses? And it's just absolutely brilliant. And it really, you just feel that you're there. She's clearly done lots of research. It's absolutely fantastic. I can't speak too highly of it. It's a really brilliant book. So it's The Eights by Joanna Miller. Absolutely great book.
Those are periods of time, aren't they? Both the wars where women's kind of roles changed dramatically in what they were going out and being able to do, and what was being accepted of what they were doing, and then it kind of almost instantly snapping back.
Absolutely. And that must have been awful, you know, to have had that freedom, to have been given those roles, you know, to do what you wanted to do in society. And it's like, oh, the men are back. Sorry, off you go, love. Back to the kitchen. Dreadful. But yeah, no, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Because you would hope that those kind of periods where women were taking on war would have changed.
Well, I think it was women's role, the way women stepped up and did men's jobs in the First World War, that hastened women having the vote. I think more so than all the suffragettes campaigning. I think, you know, men being able to see, not just the men in government, but, you know, the average man being able to see that women were capable of doing everything that men did. I think that broke down the last barriers from people who said, oh, women, they're not capable of thinking enough to have the vote, you know, they're not like us men, you know. I think, you know, that the way that women basically ran the country while all the able-bodied men were off fighting just gave the lie to that myth that women were sort of, you know, little muzzle-headed people who didn't really have the emotional or intellectual stamina to do anything substantive. You know, that was just completely nonsense, obviously.
So how many more books have you got planned in the series with Non and Basil?
So I'm only contracted to the end of book 4. I'm hoping that they'll contract me for another 2, because I've got another 2 ideas, sort of thematic ideas in mind, one of which is going to put Basil through the absolute ringer. Poor bloke.
Oh, poor Basil.
I know, but that's what we do with our characters, you know, we make them suffer. But I'd like to write more in the Typhy Valley Coroner series as well. But I just have to persuade my publisher to let me do that, because they're all about the Oxford series now. But every time I do an event, particularly in Wales, people will say to me, when's the next Harry and John book coming out? And I'm like, write to my publisher and tell them you want another one, otherwise they won't let me do one.
That's a good answer. Because there's a whole sort of thing with Basil, and he feels under pressure in this book because people are getting married.
Yeah.
Isn't he?
Yeah.
That like his secret is more likely to come out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean,
choosing not
exactly. Once the marriage bar was gone, then most, when I say young men, I mean men kind of under 50, did choose to get married. And Basil's what is he in this book? So it's 1833, so he's 36. You know, he's right plumb in the middle of the kind of marriageable age for men, and he is beginning to think, college is getting a lot less interesting, because, you know, all the men of his age have moved out, and he's left with the superannuated old parts. And also he does, I don't know whether people would have been looking at him askance, because, you know, lots of people didn't even know homosexuality existed, you know, or if they knew, they didn't acknowledge it. So it wasn't that they were suspecting every single man. But if you're as frightened about being found out as Basil is, you do feel that everybody is looking at you and thinking, why isn't he married? What's going on here? So yes, he definitely does feel the pressure to get married. And obviously his erstwhile lover, Teddy, contracted a marriage of convenience, a lavender marriage, as they say, with a gay woman. And Basil isn't a fan of that, but I can't remember whether I honestly can't remember whether this advice is still in the book or whether I cut it on the editing floor, as it were. But certainly in one of the drafts, Felicia Skeen says to Basil, do bear in mind there are many widows out there who've already had children who'd be very pleased not to have any more, but would be quite happy to be married. In other words, you know, you could have a marriage where you're not expected to father children. I can't remember whether that's, can you remember whether she says that?
No, I think that might have gone to the cutting room.
I think it might have gone through, yeah. But you know, that's also kind of going through his mind. You know, could I have a marriage where, in the parlance of the time, I didn't bother my wife? Because women, I mean, marriage was a risky business for women. Although on the one hand, it was their one chance to leave home. Every time they became pregnant, you know, they were risking death. Because the number of women who died during and as a consequence of childbirth was horrific. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. But Basil would have been very much in demand, because one of the things I discovered researching my current book was that there was a huge discrepancy in the numbers of men in the country and women. There were 750,000 more women at the 1881 census than there were men. Partly because men died in wars, partly because men die more anyway, because they have risky professions and all this kind of stuff. And also because hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands were being shipped abroad to be civil servants in the empire, and soldiers in the empire. And so there were many tens of thousands of marriage age women who just couldn't find husbands. So Basil would be very eligible. For many reasons. So yeah, that's all going to be interesting to see how that plays out, quite honestly. I have wondered whether Basil and Lily will get married. We'll see. I genuinely don't know.
No, but I think it's a really interesting way to go, and I think there's not that many, apart from David Bishop's wonderful books, there aren't that many historical crime fiction books I can think of that have
with gay characters.
in.
No, absolutely. No, there aren't. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book with a female main protagonist was because in historical fiction there aren't that many female main protagonists. And then, yeah, I thought, yes, absolutely. I mean, you're right, there's Cesare Aldo, but I actually can't. E.S. Thompson's Jem Flockhart series,
yeah,
they're very interesting, because her Jem Flockhart, he's a she. So now we would call her, I guess, a transvestite rather than trans, because it's purely, I don't think she identifies as a man. Her father insisted on having a son, and he didn't have a son, he only had a daughter. So she has been dressed as a male since she was a small child. So that's a very interesting one as well. I do recommend those. I don't know if you've ever come across E.S. Thompson.
No, they're wonderful, actually.
They're really great.
Really good.
Gosh, they should be so much better known than they are, because Jem Flockhart's a brilliant character, and they're beautifully written. And again, you're just in the period, which is the 1850s, I think, 1840s, 1850s. I can't remember. But they're absolutely great. I really think they're lovely.
They are. They're superb. No, you're right. I didn't think of Jem.
And then there's Alex Reeves, Leo Stanhope, who is trans. She identifies as a man, so it's a female to male transsexual. So yeah, there's those. But actually, gay characters, not many. I mean, I could only think of Basil and Cesare Aldo. That's it. So yeah.
And it needs to be. I mean, it existed through all periods of time.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, they may not have been out, as it were, but it was happening.
So it's good that it's being discussed.
Yes, thank you. I think so.
Yeah, no, I think so too. We have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
So remind people what they're going to go away and buy.
They're going to go and buy this, the third in the Oxford Mysteries, featuring Non Vaughan and Basil Rice, The Hunters Club. So it's out in all good bookshops now. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it through bookshop.org at your local bookshop. I'd be very grateful if you would order it from your local bookshop, because that's better for me, it's better for the bookshop, and it's better for the future of writing. Amazon, let's not even go there. And if you don't have a local bookshop, if you go onto bookshop.org, you can nominate a bookshop, or you can just have the profits from it go into the general pot, which are then distributed amongst all participating bookshops. But that's a much better deal for authors, because the prices are not screwed right down to the floor as they are on Amazon. So, because unfortunately our royalties are calculated not on the price on the back of the book, but what the book's actually sold for. So if Amazon decides to suddenly slash the price of our books to make them sell, then our royalties get slashed too, which is a bit sad.
That is a bit sad.
Yeah. So
go check out an indie bookstore then, everyone, guys.
Check out an indie bookstore and make a friend of your local independent bookseller, because they are so knowledgeable, and they will be a treasure trove of advice and new books that you would never thought to have read. I mean, the Eights, which I raved about earlier on, was recommended to me by one of the booksellers at Forum Books in Corbridge when we were on holiday in Northumberland, and she said, "Oh yeah, yes, your Oxford series, you'll like this one." And so I bought it and went away, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is just amazing!" And that's what you get from an indie bookseller, which you won't get from Waterstones, and you definitely won't get from Amazon. But your indie bookseller will be able to hand sell you things which they will think you will like based on what you've already read. So yeah, make a friend of your local bookseller.
That's brilliant advice to end on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kaz. It's been great.